I just want to explain, I'm a veterinary practitioner, I work in practice. I did this research at the weekends in my spare time as part of a presentation to the British Mastitis Council. So this is just a bit of practitioner research, but I think there might be some benefit in sharing this with you. You've had many talks on selective dry cow therapy, and there's several definitions of it, but the definition I'm using here is selection of cows on an individual basis for antimicrobial therapy at drying off, and the use of teat sealants to protect the udder from new infections. And what we found in the UK, that this has been an interesting journey for the farmers. There's been some challenges along the way, and that's what prompted me to actually get involved in this research. The background was it's taken us probably 20 years or more to persuade the farmers to adopt blanket dry cow therapy as the standard approach. And in the Netherlands, they identified that up to nearly 49% of antibiotic usage could be attributed to the use of dry cow therapy. So it's no surprise that it has now been identified as a key target for reduction. In the UK, the teat sealants were introduced in 2002, and at that point, they were only licensed to be used in isolation from antibiotics. They had to be used alone. The farmers tended to use the same technique they'd used before for infusing antibiotics, but often they didn't realise how poor their hygiene was, and that led to deaths and mastitis on some of the farms. So then what happened is that the farmers then adopted a combination approach where they used teat sealants and dry cow therapy at the same time. And we got to a point where nearly 80% of the UK dairy farms were doing that. In 2015, a large milk processor, Arla, decided to champion the cause of selective dry cow therapy. And they trained nearly 40% of their farmers and 300 plus vets in the country in selective dry cow therapy, and really sort of tried to encourage wider use of it. So the survey I did was a convenient survey. It was non-random. It went out to 497 farmers. It was a very simple survey involving just 8 questions, and there was an option to add free text and comments as you went along. There weren't any compulsory questions. And the objective of the survey was to establish the uptake of selective dry cow therapy, what hurdles and barriers existed to it, what their attitudes were towards selective dry cow therapy, and if we were to try and expand it, what would we need to do next? So these are the basic questions I asked: the herd size, their approach to dry cow therapy, any fears and concerns, any problems and experiences, benefits of selective dry cow therapy and how they perceive those, how the farmer felt about selective dry cow therapy, and then a bit of innovative stuff about the Net Promoter Score and what changes could promote wider use. What we found that the majority of respondents had herds of cows between 100 and 300 cows. And that was representative of what we find in the UK. And when we asked them about, do you use selective dry cow therapy, 40% of the farms are using it all year round over their whole herd, but there was a significant proportion of herds that were just using it on a certain section of cows, according to perhaps yield or at certain times of the year. Antibiotic dry cow therapy alone, just using straight antibiotics, was only used in 8% of herds, and there was 1% that weren't using dry cow therapy at all. When we asked the farmers about what their concern was, 55% of farmers had real serious concerns about mastitis and cow deaths with no antibiotic cover. And they also had concerns that cell counts may not be controlled as effectively. And there was issues relating to whether they might have more mastitis in their next lactation. This question was only answered by approximately half of the respondents. But when asked, have you ever experienced problems with selective dry cow therapy, 35% of those that responded had severe mastitis, and 34% had deaths after infusion of teat sealant. So I appreciate this is a non-random survey, so you know, we can't draw too many conclusions from it, but 82 respondents, or 1 in 6 farmers, experienced death and or mastitis after the use of selective dry cow therapy over the 15-year time period that they may have used it. So this is not an incidence. You know, I'm not saying that 1 in 6 farmers loses, you know, 1 in 6 cows dies, or 1 in 6 farmers have lost a cow in the last year. I'm saying in the history of use of that product, that is what has happened. On a more positive note, a third of the farmers that experienced problems, they continued with selective dry cow therapy and became proactive believers and would recommend selective dry cow therapy to other farmers. So, you know, despite that, they felt they could still proceed with it. In terms of actually what they believed the benefits of selective dry cow therapy was they felt they would use less overall antibiotic usage, which would be good for livestock, but also they could see that there was going to be good for people if we use less antibiotics on farm. So the farmers could see the importance of not using antibiotics. That was not the issue. Importance was there. When you ask them about what answers best describes how you feel about selective dry cow therapy, about 50% of the respondents would classify themselves as firm believers of selective dry cow therapy and would recommend it to other farmers. But there was a significant proportion that were doing it because their milk processor had actually asked them to do it as part of their contract, or there was farmers that thought they should be doing it. They saw it as being important, but it wasn't an important priority right now. There was also a group of farmers that didn't believe selective dry cow therapy works, and they've heard or had bad experiences before, so they were almost like what we call disillusioned farmers. So what I did was I then categorised the farmers according to the work that Rita had done for Johne's disease in cattle, where she actually did some quite interesting work where she interviewed farmers and was able to categorise those farmers according to their belief and importance of Johne's control. I did the same with selective dry cow therapy. And crudely speaking, 50% of the farmers were strong believers and thought it was important that selective dry cow therapy was used. There was about 18% that could actually see it as being important, but they believed in it, but it wasn't important to them right now, so they were unconcerned. But there was about 15% of the farmers that were disillusioned. They'd actually tried it before and it hadn't worked, and there were some that were deniers that felt it was a deeply wrong thing to do. When we ran the net promoter score question on them, which is quite an interesting thing, I'm sure many of you have done it when you've stayed in a hotel or experienced something within a particular business, where you're asked to score your experience on a 1 to 10 and say, well, how likely would you recommend selective dry cow therapy to another farmer? And you have to score it on a 1 to 10. And basically what the research has shown is that if you score something above 8, i.e. 9 and 10, you're classified as a promoter. If you score 7 and 8, you're a passive, you're fairly neutral. But anything less than 6, you're a detractor. You're not likely to recommend it to anybody. This survey showed that 48% of the farmers classified selective dry cow therapy were classified as detractors, so they scored less than 6. And only 26% were classified as true promoters. So basically, the detractors outweighed the promoters. So my conclusion from that was that the farmers are, and this came back with some of the free text work, that the farmers were reticent to recommend to other farmers selective dry cow therapy because they were worried that that farmer might end up killing a cow. So they were reticent to recommend to others because they weren't certain that the farmer could carry it out safely. So with a negative net promoter score, what would this mean is that if you left it to the farmers alone, it is highly unlikely that selective dry cow therapy will work because the number of detractors would outweigh the promoters. So I then reanalyzed the data just looking at those 4 categories of proactivists, unconcerned, disillusionists, or 3 categories I looked at. And what we basically found was that the proactivist farmers, those are the ones that believed and saw it as being important. They would value more on-farm training. So quite often the actual milk processors and the levy bodies would actually deliver more and more training. And all you end up doing is training the people that already see the belief and importance in that particular technique. But if our target is to encourage the unconcerned and the disillusioned farmers, they were reluctant to come to training because basically what they wanted was more convincing that the rewards would outweigh the risks, and actually selective dry cow therapy would work. So another route would have to be found. We couldn't just rely on training alone. So the summary so far was that selective dry cow therapy was viewed as a high-risk procedure. Most farmers understood the importance of the technique. 50% of respondents classified themselves as firm believers, but we must accept that those unconcerned and disillusionist farmers may not actually attend training events as they don't believe in the value of selective dry cow therapy. So I'm going to refer to some of the great work that Theo Lam, our chairman, has done, and there's a fantastic paper which I'd urge you to look at, which basically explains how they tackled it in Holland. And they used this reset model to actually implement their AMR initiative, and it was very carefully thought out, and it's based on actually having rules, education, social pressure, economics and tools. All those things actually have to be within your sort of gift. You've got to be able to sort of have all those things controlled, and then you use that to influence behavioural change at a national level. And in Holland, they were able to actually, this is the activities they went through, which were really quite carefully thought out for all these different elements. And when I spoke to Theo, he said, well, how did this work? Why did you get so much success? Well, one of the key things was blanket dry cow therapy was banned. But what they also did, they did all these other elements. So they really strongly featured on education, social pressure, just making sure that both the vets and farmers were on side. When I sort of just went back and had a look at what we were doing in the UK, you could see where the problems were. So there really wasn't a compulsion to apply selective dry cow therapy. There was a variable approach through different milk processes, and that tended to confound progress. So some processes were very pro-it, some veterinary practices were pro-it, and some less so. There was insufficient sort of economic gain or incentives to encourage the farmers to commit, and I don't think we've done enough in terms of education. And certainly in terms of tools, where we could have defined protocols and videos and this sort of thing, essentially they weren't there. And that was probably the reason why we were struggling with it. So the outcomes of this work really was we ended up improving coordination and messaging. We got better knowledge transfer involving videos and guides. We increased the use of testimonials from proactive farmers to help encourage other farmers to get involved. We put more focus on economic and cost benefit, and we actually challenged the vets to actually get involved in vet-led training and encourage the milk processors to get involved. Our levy body actually then developed a set of common educational materials that could be used, and these would actually, these are videos using experts saying this is how the dry cow therapy should be applied and this is how the process should be run. And then standard protocols were adopted and infusion techniques. And this has greatly helped the development of selective dry cow therapy in the UK. So just in summary, selective dry cow therapy can be successfully deployed, providing a consistent approach to delivery is applied. So we've got to use that sort of reset approach, make sure we get all the ducks in a row. We must educate the vets and farmers, and that's absolutely crucial to be successful. But we also must be mindful that those unconcerned and disillusioned farmers are not necessarily going to attend any training events, so we must find alternative routes for them. And centralised resources and tools are really essential for that consistent outcome. Thank you.